Hello everyone. Welcome. This is Harsh and Arshdeep here, and welcome to Cognito Talks. Today we have with us Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and Arshdeep will go on with an introduction.
Right. So from Secunderabad to the power corridors of Delhi, Sir has been through it all. He's seen it all. For the past 3 decades, he has played a crucial role in the economic reforms and the policy regulations done within the past 3 decades. Right. And sir, you were there when our economy changed from a state-run economy to a market-based economy. You played a crucial role in that as well. It's an honor to have you with us, and we're delighted to conduct
Yes.
this interview.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I look forward to the interaction. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, sir. So while we were researching about you, we came across your background as you have been to some of the prestigious colleges in the world. Firstly, at St. Stephen's in Delhi University, and later on to Oxford. So, sir, my question is, what was your experience like as compared to what you think is different, because you grew up in a very different time than what we have today? So, what in your view is different today from that what it was in past?
That's a good question. I think the difference is actually enormous. When I was growing up, we were not a very interconnected country. It wasn't very easy even to telephone Mumbai. I come from a very modest family background. We never had a telephone at home. So my father had a telephone in his office, but we didn't have a telephone at home. And even if you had a telephone at home, it was not easy to connect to even Mumbai, let alone internationally. Now you're living in a world in which if you have a smartphone, or not even a smartphone, a feature phone, you can pretty much phone anywhere you like and at a very affordable price. So first point is the degree of connectivity that you guys enjoy is phenomenal. And I mean, those of you who have smartphones, I mean, practically have the whole of Wikipedia at your fingertips. It's a terrible world to be a teacher in, because, students sitting in class can simply kind of check on Google any kind of issue and ask difficult questions. Whereas when I was a kid, it was very difficult to put teachers in a difficult position because you had to do a hell of a lot of hard work. So that's point number one. Point number two, and quite honestly, is that the economy is changing very rapidly for two different reasons. One is that, of course, we're open, and therefore new technologies are coming in a lot faster than they did earlier. I mean, earlier we were not open, and as a result, in the very early 60s or late 50s, we brought in the Morris Oxford, which became the Hindustan ambassador, and the Millicento Fiat, which became the Padmini. And when we brought them in, they were really not all that different from state-of-the-art technology at the time. But since we were not open, the same damn things continued right up to the early 90s with no change. I mean, not early 90s, certainly mid 80s. And it was only Maruti that modernized the system. That means that from 1960 to 1983, when the first Maruti was rolled out, there was no change at all in the world of automotives. Today, we find Elon Musk talking about bringing Tesla to India. And it's only a few years ago that the thing was operational in the United States. So you're living in a world where you're piggybacking on technology change. And the economy, thanks to economic reforms, and that's a very, very important change, because quite frankly, when I look back on it, the system that we were running in the 1960s was just ridiculous. Most countries had these very tight controls because as a hangover from the war. But most countries got rid of it in the early 50s. We carried on till 1990. And as a result, the economy grew very, very slowly. Now, when I was a kid, and we had a growth rate, what used to be called the Hindu rate of growth at 3.5%, with population growing at 2.2. So, the per capita income growth was kind of less than 1.5, maybe 1.3% per year. At that rate of per capita income growth, it takes about 45 years for per capita income to double. And you know, structural change does not take place because GDP increases. It takes place because per capita GDP increases. And the reason for that is very simple. I mean, you can have in India with, you know, 500 million people at a certain level of income, and then that India becomes 1 billion people and has twice the GDP, but the same per capita income. There's no structural change. I mean, everybody consumes more or less the same thing, etc., except they consume more of it. When per capita income changes, things begin to change very dramatically. I mean, in the simplest way, consumption patterns change. You spend much less on basic food and necessities, more on other consumer goods, and in due course, more on higher income consumer goods. That changes the structure of the society. Now, if you apply that to what's happening today, I mean, for the last, during the high growth rate years in the, say from 2004, when I was in government, say 2004 to 2014, I mean, there were good and bad years within that, and I'm not saying that those were glory years and so on, but the average growth rate in that period was 7.6%, and the population growth rate in that period was 1.5%. So per capita income grew at more than 6% per year. Now, you know, at that growth rate, per capita income kind of doubles in, I don't know, something like 10 years or so. So you're growing up in a world in which per capita income doubles, which means all the structural change that in my generation happened over 45 years is going to happen in 10 years. So you're kind of seeing change at 4.5 times the rate that we saw. And this is going to have a profound effect on the kind of world you grow up in, the kind of jobs you're going to have. And I keep telling people that therefore don't ask people like me for advice, because quite honestly, we are not in a position to judge what the future is going to be like, because it's going to be very different. I mean, this is what, you know, the American baseball player is famous for. Yogi Berra is famous for having made a lot of witty remarks, and one of the best ones is it is very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And you need to keep that in mind. I mean, we're seeing that now in a negative way because the pandemic has created a whole different situation. But I think we're also at the cusp of tremendous technology changes in certain areas, which actually haven't filtered down to have their final effect. And one of the important things that's going to do, frankly, is on education. I mean, in my generation, the idea of education was you went to a university, you either worked for 3 years or 4 years, or got a degree, then got a job. And then, if you got a good job, you kind of stayed in it forever. Now, that's not going to be the world you're in. I mean, first of all, learning is not going to be concentrated and shouldn't be concentrated in 4 years of your life. You better get used to a process of constant learning, which also means, when you're learning in the course of your life, it's not your degrees that matter, as long as you're constantly learning. I mean, if somebody applies for a job at the age of 22, the most important thing they want to know is, what's your degree? But when you apply for a job at 45, they're not interested in what's your degree. They want to know, what you do in the last 4 years or 5 years. And therefore, and secondly, I mean, whereas in my generation, people thought that a good CV was one in which you said, I joined this firm and I rose in the firm and I worked in it for 20 years, etc. Frankly, that's a very boring CV today, because people put more value on somebody who says, look, I hadn't a clue what I wanted to do after I left college. I mean, my parents wanted me to do X and Y. I wasn't absolutely sure, so I did this. Didn't like it after 3 years or so, so I changed and did something else, and did well in that. And I said, maybe this is what I want to do. And so I did something else similar. That didn't work out, but I quickly changed and did something else, and that worked out. You have a vast variety of experience. And right. I think it's going to be a more flexible world. It's not a world that your parents are going to understand. Because if you
Yes.
tell your parents, I'm going to do this, and if I don't like it, I'm going to give it up, they're going to say, you're crazy, because that's when you should be getting married and raising children. And I mean, these are difficult choices to make. And quite
Yes.
frankly, I'm not saying I don't envy you, because it's rather exciting to have take these risks on your own strength. But believe me, imitating anybody whom your father describes, your mother describes as a success would be a huge mistake, because that's not the world you're living in anymore.
Right.
Mm.
So once you were done with your college education, you had a stint with World Bank, which is also quite an achievement, because at the age of 28 itself, you were one of the youngest division chiefs there. What was the journey over there like?
The World Bank, when I joined it, was a very exciting place, because it was the only place in the West where you could actually deal with the developing world and look at it from the outside. But I found, I mean, when I went there, I thought I'd be there for maybe 3-4 years and then come back to India, because I always wanted to get into policy making. And it's a very attractive job. And I got married, and that always leads to a little bit of refocusing of attention. So I'm afraid I stayed there for much longer than I originally thought. But fortunately, after about 11 years, I did get an opportunity to go back into the government of India, not go back, go into the government of India, and then I came back. I mean, what the World Bank is now, frankly, I have no idea at all. But it's a very different world, because if you are in the international job market, I would not at all conclude that the UN or the World Bank are the places to go to. I mean, they may be, they're one of them, but there's a whole multinational world of business which will give you a lot of exposure to the rest of the world, which actually didn't exist when I was there. I mean, you could emigrate and join a business abroad, but the idea that you would join a global business was not at all as common as it is today. Although there were companies that gave you that global opportunity. I mean, I've mentioned this, I think, in my book Backstage, that after I left Oxford, I was offered a job in Levers in London. And they said that, look, if you do well, we could send you back to India and so on. But I didn't really want to work in the commercial world. I wanted to work on policy. And when the World Bank came along, that seemed like an opportunity where I'd learn quite a bit about what other developing countries are doing. So I took it.
Right. So, sir, when you came back to India, you were in positions like the Special Secretary to the PM, Finance Secretary, and Commerce Secretary. There were various portfolios that you held then. Obviously, we're back in the 1980s. It was a state-run economy then. How were things different then to what they are now?
Well, I think I said that at the very beginning. I mean, the system we were running earlier was about 20 years out of date. When I started working for Rajiv Gandhi, I mean, he was a modern type of, not a traditional politician. He wouldn't have gone into politics if his mother hadn't been assassinated. So in the early years, he talked about preparing India for the 21st century and so forth. And one of the things he said in Parliament is that, look, we can't compete with other countries if you're working with systems that are 20 years out of date. And he was absolutely right. But he wasn't actually able to change the system. It's very difficult when you want to make changes. So we made a start, but some very, very modest changes were made. And it was really in 1991, with Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister, that we were able to make really dramatic changes. I mean, I had worked in the government by then for over 10 years, and I was aware that within government, people, at the technocratic level, people recognized that change was necessary. But we didn't have at the top a political commitment to make dramatic change. I mean, Rajiv Gandhi talked about it, but he has. When you come into politics from outside, you have to learn the ropes, and I don't think he had enough time. I mean, in China, for example, most people regard the Chinese reforms as due to Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping had been in the Communist Party for decades. He was actually thrown out, kicked out by Mao, brought back again in 1978 and 76. And then at 78, he actually rose to the top positions. And he was there for something of the order of 12 to 13 years, during which period he changed changed China dramatically. Rajiv Gandhi lost steam within a couple of years because of the Bofors scandal, and then got the democratic politics. Something or the other is always cropping up, so it forces you to have much slower changes. Unfortunately, in 1991, we had a first-rate crisis, and it's not just that we had a crisis, but that the government changed. I mean, VP Singh and Chandrasekhar's government. VP Singh's government fell, Chandrasekhar's government fell, Congress government came back in. It's very easy, it's much easier to make changes in the middle of a crisis if you can blame the crisis on some other fellows. Now, if the crisis happens on your own watch, you can't say, oh, by the way, this is a crisis, I'm now going to do things completely differently. But in this case, you had a crisis and you had a change of government. The new government was able to say, look, we've got to do something differently. And we're fortunate that Dr. Singh knew exactly what needed to be done. And more importantly, Narasimha Rao also realized that these changes were necessary and he backed him. I mean, if he had not backed Manmohan Singh, I mean, you wouldn't have had the economic reforms. Right. And even he found that it wasn't easy to get reforms done. You have to do these things gradually. But the disadvantage of that is the benefits take longer to come in. The advantage is that there's a lot of consultation, you get people together, and even though the opposition criticizes you, when they come into power, they do something similar. And that's more or less what happened, because the Rao's government fell in 96, the United Front government came in, which had the Communist Party of India amongst its members. They didn't reverse the reforms, although the Communist Party had opposed them strongly. Even they managed to carry forward for 2 years. Then the BJP government came in. BJP had criticized the reforms when they were in opposition, but the Vajpayee government actually continued the reforms and in fact deepened them. Then the UPA government came in 2004. They, of course, originally had started the reforms, so they also continued. And actually, when the Modi government came in, I mean, it was a very contested election. And, you know, in politics, you always say negative things about whoever you're opposing. But if you look at the content of what the Modi government did, they didn't reverse policy. They criticized the previous government, too much corruption, etc. And they said, we're going to do things more determinedly, faster, etc. But they pushed the reforms that were put on the pipeline were not very different. The program names were changed. That's fine. That's not very important. So I think as a result of all these reforms that are being done, we do have a very different situation in the country today from what it was earlier, and it's going to be interesting for you guys to work within it.
Yes. So, sir, now coming to the current regime, well, in 2021, and something which is similar to the 1991 reforms as well, a lot of public enterprises are going private. At least that's what they're planning to do with Air India and a couple of banks as well. What is your take on this? And if those banks are allowed to be privatized and corporate houses are brought in, how serious is the threat of connected lending?
Well, let me say that you say that I think it's true that the present government, one of the areas where they have made a significant departure from the past is overtly and clearly saying that they're going to privatize most of the public sector, which is not in strategic areas. In the past, I mean, the program was began with what was called disinvestment. Then when the Vajpayee government came in, they talked about doing more privatization. And frankly, Arun Shourie did succeed in doing some very important ones. But all those resistances that prevent it surfaced, and even within the BJP, he was stymied and privatization stopped. When the UPA came in, they just carried on the disinvestment, but they never really did any privatization. This government is the first one that has said, yes, we want to privatize. I think that's a good thing, by the way. I mean, I personally feel that you've got to step back and ask yourself, what sort of an economy does India need? Now, I don't share the view of many people who think that government should get out of everything. That's not true, because even in the sophisticated economy, government has a very capitalist economy, government has a very big role to play. Certainly, government has to deliver a whole lot of essential services, health, education, law and order, security, good regulation, etc. Only government can do that. I think it also, in many societies, has to take on the burden of building a lot of the infrastructure. And you know, people don't realize that in what were called the market-led economies, much of the infrastructure building that actually took place was because of a direct government perception that we need to do something. I mean, let me just give you two examples in the United States, and that both came out of defense. One is that the huge US national highways, which those of you who have driven on, I mean, they're now pretty kind of run down, according to many of my American friends. But you know, they're wide lanes and all over the place, etc. The argument that the government must construct these large highways with very broad lanes was justified on the grounds that in the event of a military conflict, fighter planes should be able to land on these lanes if necessary. Okay, most people don't realize this. Secondly, the basis of the internet, the idea of packet switching and connecting computers where you can send messages through the whole network, originated from work done by DARPA, the Defense Something Research Agency, which was again security driven, because if you do the normal kind of telecommunications, you can kill the whole system by bumping off an important part of it. Whereas in a network communication system, messages will just go through different routes. And in fact, when you get a message, each message doesn't come through the same route. It just finds whatever route there is and then gets reassembled. That was also government research funding. So government has a very big role to play, but government does not have to. I mean, at one time we had bread making in government, modern bakeries, a ridiculous idea. And then government doesn't have to be in all kinds of things, including automobiles and scooters and so on. So my basic assumption here is that most people should agree that if India is going to do well, it's going to be a private sector led growth process with government playing a critical role. Only trouble is government should not be doing what it used to do. It should play the role it's supposed to play. It's not doing enough on health. It's not doing enough on education. It's doing a lousy job on law and order. The courts are clogged. Commercial decisions take 10 times longer than they do in the rest of the world. And frankly, in my view, if we privatize most of the public sector and improve the quality in these areas by double, India would do wonderfully. Now, this is not an uncontroversial statement. Many people would disagree with this. And I think you as students should know that although I'm giving you my prejudice, which is that 90% of what we call public sector should be privatized, there are other people equally distinguished and certainly older and as old who would have a different view. So I would earnestly ask you to debate this amongst yourselves, knowing that this is an issue on which there are differences, and please decide what you want. All I can say is that when I look around at what I buy, I almost never choose a public sector product, except when it comes to universities. That's the role in education. If the government were, I mean, fortunately, we gave up having government manufacturing bread. But it's laughable that we had government manufacturing bread, and doubly laughable that it took years to get rid of the damn thing. So my view is that the government is right, but the government should be upfront and transparent. I mean, in a way, I wonder whether it was the right thing to do to say we're going to privatize all public sector. You're just creating, God knows how many unions will get worried. It would be much better to say, look, in the course of this year, we're going to fully privatize these 4 public sector enterprises. And please find a transparent way of doing it so that nobody complains that you sold them off to your buddies, because that complaint will come. I mean, Arun Shuri, who after all was one of the leading lights of the BJP and a wonderful person, I mean, was troubled for years with inquiries and this, that, and the other. And the problem is, in that background, the bureaucracy will not be supportive. I mean, the bureaucracy would like to put forward notes which raise 20 reasons why it shouldn't be done, or if it is to be done, the responsibility should be taken higher up at the political level. And I think we have to recognize that, and this should be made very clear. Now, turning to private sector. It's wrong in my view to say that you need to privatize the banks because otherwise you get connected lending. This is actually very unfair to the public sector banks. It's true that banks are often put under pressure to lend to good things. But at one time when we were saying the economy is going to grow at 9%, you can't grow unless you have infrastructure. Government doesn't have the money for infrastructure. We're allowing the private sector to build infrastructure, so please lend for infrastructure. But nobody said that you should lend to weak private parties. On the other hand, we didn't actually allow a lot of foreign guys to bid. So the desire that you must balance the scale towards domestic competition was very strong. And even on domestic competition, there was very strong pressure that you shouldn't set very high standards for eligibility, because then smaller people would not be able to come in. Now, these are genuine political problems. At one time, when I first joined the government, not joined first, but in the 90s, there were many states that would divide up the contract for building a road. That's not privatization, it's just outsourcing. Into building into 5-kilometer stretches to be awarded to different contractors, instead of sort of awarding a 100-kilometer stretch to one contractor and letting him do subcontracting. If you do the former, that guy will build up a production capability, invest in machines, etc. If you award little contracts, you're stuck with all kinds of people, some of whom will not produce good work, some of whom will not do it on time. So I think these are learning processes which need to be understood and fed back into the government so that they don't make the same mistake again. But I think on the banks, all said and done, we have too large a presence of public sector banks. The problem is not connected lending. The problem is that in a public sector bank, the rules under which bankers work force them to follow very, very rigid procedures. In the public sector, there is no incentive to take a risk. If you don't take any risk and you follow all the procedures strictly, and the companies do badly and the economy does badly, you will be quite safe and you will still be promoted when your time comes.
Right.
You are not creating an environment in which bankers are testing their skills by taking risks. I mean, if you test your skill by taking risk, you may choose 10 companies, 2 of which will fail and not return your loans, but the other 8 will do well. You could have made 8 excellent decisions, but if you made 1 incorrect decision and you are accused of having done that because of corruption, and they find that some procedure was not followed or fast-tracked, you could become vulnerable. Now, that is not an environment in which lending can take place. And I think you need to get rid of that, and you can only get rid of it if the government equity goes down below 51%. Because as long as government equity is below 51%, is up to 51%, the unit under our constitution is treated the same as government. What this means, in the State Bank of India, for example, was not allowed to do campus recruitment because it was felt that that gives a selective advantage to the best university. So they were told, you advertise and choose from whoever comes in. Whereas all private sector banks go to universities and have a recruitment campaign where they choose the best products and persuade them to come to their company. So, you know, and of course, there's salary problems. You can't, I mean, in a world in which the private sector banking is really expanding rapidly, we are quite willing to allow new private sector banks to come. And they are expanding their share of the sector. As a result, the banking sector is being privatized, but we are not willing to privatize any public sector bank. And I think that's just crazy. So I think I support the idea of privatizing a couple of banks, and let's see how they do.
So, sir, that brings me to my next question. Recently, Dr. Raghuram Rajan came up with a new paper, research paper of sorts out, in which he mentioned that privatizing the banks right now is not a good decision because there is no concrete plan as such in place to privatize them. They have just said that we want to privatize it, but there's no plan in place. So, sir, like the only time I've heard of this is like what happened with Soviet Union back in 1991, when the country collapsed and when the Russian Federation was going private. It led to it led to a crony capitalism of sorts, which we call oligarchy today. So, do you think if we could face something of this sort, which we cannot foresee right now, but we might have to face the repercussions of 30 years down the lane?
No, that's a very important. I mean, Ram Rajan did a very interesting book, I think jointly with, I forget his
Viralacharya.
Viralacharya. Sorry?
Viralacharya too. It was Viralacharya.
No, not Viralacharya. It was his co-author of the book which says Saving Capitalism from the Capitalist. Okay?
Yes.
And I think it is very important when you privatize to have a very clear plan. One aspect of the plan is to indicate which bank is going to be privatized. I think they probably have done that. I don't know if they've done it, but they say they're going to do it. But the way in which the privatization has to be done also has to be very carefully planned and worked out, so that it is not done in a non-competitive manner. Okay, I'm quite sure that if you lay out a plan and you let it be discussed in public, any dangers of cronyism will surface in the course of the discussion. So I have no idea what the government intends to do, but I'm assuming that the manner of privatization will be made public, and I'm sure they should make sure that they are not accused of having simply handed it over to preferred capitalists. I mean, clearly. One of the big debates going on is whether banks should be owned by existing private companies which are in the real economy. So far, the view has been no. Some committee of the Reserve Bank has said, no, there's no harm in letting them come in. That's going to be a big issue that again should be debated and a view taken on it. But you know, the most important thing is to get rid of the majority holding. I mean, the first step should be that you just sell off 10% to whoever wishes to bid for the shares. And it could be a whole bunch of sovereign wealth funds and other people taking the government share below 51%. This will require an amendment in the Nationalization Act, so it will go to Parliament. Once that happens, these will no longer be subject to public sector rules. And I think in that framework, they would be free to set different salaries for top people. I think PJ Nayak, in his report, which was submitted in 2015, had made an excellent suggestion that the government should put all its shareholding in the banks into a holding corporation. This holding corporation should be run by professionals in the financial sector chosen by the government, reporting to a board of distinguished people, which should not be just a bunch of civil servants. Okay, these people should then choose the chief executive, or rather, these people should choose the board of the bank, which should include a lot of professionals, and the board of the bank should then elect whoever is to be the chief executive. And this should not go to the government at all. Now, you know, this would pull the finance ministry out of all effective control over the banking, over the public sector banks. This should be accompanied by another step, and that is that the Reserve Bank should have the same power over public sector banks that it has over private sector banks. People don't realize it, but at the moment, that's not true. I mean, the Reserve Bank can throw out a top manager, the top CMD in a private sector bank if, in its view, the CMD is not the right person. It doesn't have to accuse him of wrongdoing. You just say, no, we're not satisfied. Okay? You're not a fit and proper person. It cannot do that in a public sector bank. Now, there's no reason why that should be so. If the Reserve Bank feels that a particular public sector manager is too much subjected to political influence, it should be able to get rid of him. And if you gave the Reserve Bank that power, then it would exercise its supervisory role much more seriously. Since you haven't given it the power, it just says nothing to do with me. Now, these are the things that need to be spelled out. And maybe the government is going to do it, I don't know. But certainly the financial press is very aware of these things, and they're being discussed. So as students, you should familiarize yourself with these issues. And Raghuram, Rajan, Viril Acharya, even Urjit Patel, they've all written about it. But you know, having said that, there are also other views. And I think you should keep that. Lots of people who say that, you know, I mean, nobody says that government should use public sector banks to push lending to certain people. And mind you, those accusations exist even in private sector banks. It's not as if in the private sector bank that doesn't happen ever. But in a private sector bank, the overall performance is quite good. Because whereas the public sector banks have run up huge NPAs, the private sector banks have also run up NPAs, but nowhere of the same order. So while there may be the odd wrongdoing, and I don't want to mention any names, the fact is that the system as a whole has performed much better, and there should be no doubt on that. Okay.
So, sir, in your tenure as an economist for Government of India and World Bank and even IMF, you must have seen a lot of boom cycles and the burst cycles. And right now, like exactly 1 year ago, as the world economies around the world, they were bleeding. The financial markets were bleeding, and everyone lost it. But since then, and in a span of 1 year, there has been a sort of 100% recovery. If you hadn't invested money, then you would have made 100% of your capital invested. So, sir, what do you think is different about this bull from the other ones? And how do you think they're also this bull run is different from the other ones of the past?
Well, you know, first of all, there are always bull runs. So the whole nature of a stock market is that you get an upswing, and when you have an upswing beyond a certain point, you tend to get irrational exuberance, which is what the US guy called it, and then it gets overdone, and then you get a crash, and things correct themselves. And the argument really is that when the Reserve Bank or the central bank sees this happening, it should tighten money supply to prevent the bull run from getting too far. Of course, the problem with that is it's always very difficult to judge when it's gone too far. There's always somebody saying, no, this is firmly based in some assumptions about productivity growth. This is especially difficult in India because, you know, in the United States, productivity growth is a result of changes in technology, and they happen gradually. in India, our productivity levels are so much below the frontier that you can always argue that the reforms we are doing are suddenly going to make us catch up big time. So there's a bigger danger of unwarranted optimism. Okay, there's no easy way of solving this problem, but usually the argument is that the central bank should make a judgment, and when things are going too fast, just tighten up credit. The big difference between earlier runs and the current one is that the current one is taking place in a world of massive overexpansion of liquidity. Around the world, the central banks are expanding their balance sheet, lending like mad, huge increases in money supply, all justified on the ground that the economy is suffering and therefore we need to do more. There is an argument, by the way, as to whether the doing more should be fiscal or should be monetary. And certainly in the United States, earlier they weren't doing enough fiscal, just relying on money supply. The danger when you do that is the money sloshes around and goes into different asset classes, whether it's housing or stocks, and bids up these stock prices, even though the commodity price inflation doesn't go up. That has happened to an unbelievable degree in the world, and it's largely because the real economy was depressed owing to the pandemic. We've had the same sort of thing happen in India. We've had very little fiscal expansion. Personally, I think we should have had more. And we've had lots of more liquidity. And in any case, apart from what the RBI creates, when the world is sloshing around with liquidity, that liquidity comes into India in the form of capital inflows. So we get liquidity too. And a lot of that goes into the stock market. Now, frankly, around the world, the stock market is completely disconnected from what's happening in the real economy, completely. And in a way, I mean, this raises some interesting questions. I mean, what should be done? One of the problems is that if we just tighten up our own liquidity, but the world remains awash in liquidity, we may not be able to stop this because money will flow in. And the danger that that creates is that when mood changes, the same money will flow out and create the reverse problems. So I don't think we had this degree of connectivity earlier. I mean, when the Harshad Mehta boom occurred, it was entirely a domestic-driven thing. And it was not official expansion of liquidity. It was just pulling money out of the banks in an illegal way and using it to speculate in the stock market. So even if the Reserve Bank had tightened money supply, this would have continued. Today, what you're seeing is a global expansion in liquidity where basically central banks are turning their back on what used to be regarded as conventional wisdom.
Yes, sir. Since you brought up the talk point about fiscal policies, and right now a lot of buzz going around the media in India specifically is about the petrol prices of the country. Now, in some states, the petrol prices are stretching 100 rupees per liter, and we have seen this happening since 2013. Even though the petrol prices around the world has started going down, the petrol prices in India were still increasing. And now we all understand that the government has to fund the fiscal deficit of the nation. But at the same time, right now, when the prices have started going up on the rise again, how long do you think that the end consumer, that is the average citizen, the average taxpayer, can bear the brunt of these taxes that are being put on the fuel? Because fuel is also very, very much correlated with the inflationary times in the economy. When the fuel prices rise, everything along with it goes up. So how, in your opinion, how is it, how long will we have to face the brunt of this situation, not brunt of the situation, but uh, fund the fuel economy or the fuel prices, the fuel taxes, and how, what do you think can be done differently to curb this situation?
Well, I mean, I can't judge how long the public will tolerate anything. I guess politicians have to make that judgment, and I'm sure they're making it. I mean, the notion that the public cannot bear the burden. I mean, I can see the logic of saying that when world prices went down, you didn't allow the consumer price to go down, so you took up the benefit. Now that world prices are going up, you should stabilize consumer prices. But of course, what that means is you should give up the revenue. Okay. If you had a very strong fiscal situation, otherwise, you probably could do that. You don't have a strong fiscal situation. So you could make the case that, look, why don't you let the fuel prices go down and put the tax on something else? Now, I'm not sure that I have not heard anyone arguing yet that, look, you shouldn't raise fuel prices, but why don't you raise the same money by putting tax on this, that, and the other ordinary commodity? There's no support from that. So all that people are saying is, listen, things are tough and we want to be taxed less. Good luck. I mean, that's an issue. I think government has to decide how big a fiscal deficit does it think it can run without adverse consequences. I mean, I can't answer that question. That has to be answered by whichever state or central government is making those decisions.
Yes. So, coming to something much more recent, during the COVID-19 crisis, you were asked by the government of Punjab to advise them. Now, during this time, you suggested the creation of a Punjab Innovation Fund of nearly 150 crores. Now, as I understand it, the government of Punjab has like a 10% stake in it and has put in about 15 crores in it. Now, this is an unprecedented move. We haven't really seen a government, the government creating a fund to fund entrepreneurs and startups in one particular state. How did this move come about? And
yeah, I mean, let me clarify. I don't think the Punjab government asked me to advise them. The chief minister set up a group of experts and asked me to chair it. So it's not me that's advising, it's the whole group. And we have submitted an interim report and we'll be submitting our final report. One of the important recommendations that we made, we were not asked to handle the ongoing current problem. We were asked, what should Punjab do in the longer term to recover its earlier preeminent position? And our view was that one of the most important things that's happening around the world is the stimulus that's being given to startups, which can ride on the growing wave of digitalization and greater connectivity and more innovation and so on. And we felt that Punjab had not done as well as it could have, given that, say, Bangalore and Hyderabad have moved ahead, and that Punjab has enough entrepreneurship and also technically skilled people that it should get into this act. We had recommended that one of the things you should do is to create a Punjab innovation mission and also to set up an innovation fund so that the innovation mission would work to create an environment where more and more investors and mentors, etc., would take an interest in Punjab. Universities in Punjab would set up innovation labs where people could experiment, and there would be an innovation fund which would provide startup funding for startups. So I'm very pleased that the Punjab government accepted this recommendation. The innovation mission has been set up and it is now headed by Mr. Pramod Bhasin, who was a member of this group. It's a private sector-led initiative. I mean, this is a very important point because we made the point that it's very easy to set up a mission and put a secretary to the government in charge of it. That will not achieve what is necessary. You should set up a private sector-led process, but you should support it with government funding. And I think to the credit of Punjab government and Captain Amrinder Singh, they back that idea. And they have set up the mission. Mr. Bhasin has been made the chairman. They've set up this innovation fund. They made a contribution to it. And now we have to see how it moves forward. And we will be submitting our own assessment of progress within a couple of weeks from now. But my preliminary information is that this particular program has gone very well.
You should.
Okay, so sir, like I had this question about so during the 2008, the housing crisis of 7 and 8, Following the housing crisis, around the world, the developed economies had gone into the negative territory of the GDP growth. And big economies like China had contracted by a fair margin, but but our economy did not. Like ours also did contract, but we still had the growth. And as the data suggests, the World Bank data suggests, we bounced back within a year. Like we came back to the 2008 levels, 7-8 levels after 1 year. Whereas our Western counterparts did not, even though they were doing something called quantitative easing that they had introduced during those times. So, sir, what do you think we as a country and the government at the time did differently as compared to others that we did not, even though we faced a lot of problems during those times, we did not face them as severely as our Western counterparts?
No, that's a good question. Let me clarify one thing. I don't think China contracted, by the way.
No, sir,
The reason, no, their growth rate may have gone down, but it was very, very high. It didn't contract. We contracted in the sense that our growth rate also went down, but it was not negative, not like last year. The reason we were able to recover quickly is we imparted a huge fiscal stimulus. Now, this was carefully thought out. We were aware that the Chinese are doing it. We did not think that the solution lay in monetary easing. So some people felt that we should rely on monetary easing. We didn't think that the transmission of monetary easing to the real economy would be that good. It's better to do a lot of direct fiscal stimulus. We were later criticized for it because that stimulus, it was meant to be withdrawn within one more year. And I think we failed to do that because, you know, the problem is when you stimulate the economy, everybody cheers. But when you say, well, now that the economy is recovered, I'm cutting this expenditure, nobody cheers. And I think people who recommend stimulus should always have in mind the very clear plan to withdraw the stimulus. I think if I were criticizing our own performance, I think we should have been faster in withdrawing the stimulus. And actually, a lot of the stimulus consisted of lowering taxes. And we should have even initially said, we're lowering it for this year and next year is going to be raised. We didn't do that. And when the time came, we didn't raise tax. The global economy also recovered and international inflation went up. So we had a problem where while the GDP went up, inflation went up, and the government was much criticized for it. Now, I feel that in the present situation, I personally feel we should have had a more fiscal stimulus earlier than we did. The budget says that there is going to be a lot of fiscal stimulus, but it's coming quite late in the day. I personally think it should have come in the first 6 months. And I think it's correct that we should not withdraw it immediately because the economy is not actually recovered. It's getting to recover. So it's good that next year, you know, the finance minister is envisaging a significant fiscal deficit. The real challenge will be from the next year onwards. How do we get back? What are we going to cut? What tax revenues are we going to raise? And those are the issues that you guys need to discuss and think about. Okay? Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you for
taking
Okay.
time off the schedule.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye.